Another negative aspect is that almost all of a sudden they had the equivalent of compulsory education. They wanted to get all the eligible kids into school. And that really upset some of the traditional economy because, older children had responsibilities at home. And some of them were put into residential schools. But more were put into what they called hostels, like at Inuvik and Fort Smith and Yellowknife. There were hostels where the students stayed. So they were away from home almost 10 months of the year. And they could go home like at Christmas time. But there was alienation because of that.
I wonder if we could just stop for a second. We interrupted you. Go ahead from the point you were at.
Oh, yeah.
You're talking about
The residential schools.
Yeah, and unfortunately, there was more racial discrimination than people wanted to admit. When I worked as a counselor, I heard a lot of the complaints of students. I mean, they would tell what was happening to them where they wouldn't tell the teachers and so on. So I'll give you a couple examples. There was a young Inuit fellow who was staying in the hostel at Yellowknife, and he was being sexually molested. This was a young fellow, about 22 years old. It reached a point where he wanted to get out of there. He wanted to get back to his community on Hudson's Bay. He wanted to get back there at any cost, and they would not let him go. Well, he became suicidal. When that point was reached, I put a lot of pressure on, and I got him home. Then, if you're interested in talking about the class system in a mining town, I can tell you something about that. There was a high school student from Aklavik. His father was a famous polar bear hunter. He was a mixture of Inuit and African. He got his African blood when the whalers came in to the Northwest Territories. So he was a mixed blood person. He was talented, a good athlete, artistic ability. And at the same high school, there was a daughter of one of the mining executives. Well, they developed a mutual crush. The vice principal of the school was determined to break that up. He didn't like what was going on. And I didn't have a problem with it. I felt it's something that will resolve itself. So, a lot of pressure was put on this young fellow to drop out. We knew this. I knew that. So how we handled it was this way. Three of us who were teachers found him a boarding home in Saskatoon, and we arranged for him to continue in high school down in Saskatoon, and he went there. After that, I lost track of him. I came south, and I didn't know. But a few years later, I found out that he had committed suicide. The churches operated the hostels, but the hostel in Yellowknife was operated by the federal government. The hostel in Fort Smith, I think, was operated by a Catholic religious order. Yeah. While I was with the NWTTA, something deplorable was exposed at Inuvik. That was an Anglican hostel. And it was discovered that there was gross sexual molestation going on there. The executive of the NWTTA took a stand on that. We took a hard stand. So I think we had some influence in getting the pedophiles removed. Okay, yeah. At the hostel in Yellowknife, there were some very sad episodes. There were three teenagers, three teenaged women attending school who stayed in the hostel, and they were from the Great Slave Lake area. Well, one weekend, when they were downtown, they were picked up by miners. They were taken to the giant mine, and they spent a weekend there, and they were, of course, exploited all weekend. When that news came back to the administrator of the hostel, he immediately expelled them. They were 16, 17-year-old girls. They were expelled, and as far as I know, to this day, nothing was done to the miners who victimized those kids. In the hostel, there was a head supervisor who unquestionably was molesting young adults, guys. And it was atrocious because some of these guys worked during the summer and they made pretty good money. They'd come back to school in the fall, and this guy would play banker for them. He handled their funds, not all of them, but for some of them. And we came to the conclusion that in some cases he was bribing these young people. He was saying, you can't have your money unless you come across. We knew this was going on, and it took us almost a year to get that guy removed. Later, when I was with the Department of Indian Affairs in Alberta, working in St. Paul, it turned out that this guy had been hired by the United Church as supervisor, a boys supervisor in the St. Albert residence. I went to my boss in the federal building and I said, look, you know what's going on. This guy had to give up his job in Yellowknife because circumstantially there was good evidence that he was molesting young adults. Do you know what my boss said? That may be true, but he's keeping the lid on out at St. Albert. And I shouted at the top of my voice to my boss in the federal building. I said, "You're treating me just like an Indian." He never said a word after that. It's ghastly.
That's the question. Explain all the sexual molestation that goes on. We've heard reports for years now about the sexual exploitation of Aboriginal children in these residential schools. Is there an answer that you developed as to why it happens to such a great degree there?
I have a document in my archives dated 1953. And the Oblate Fathers had a conference in Winnipeg, and they were trying to develop a psychology for Indigenous people. And of course, that original document was in French, but I got an English translation of it. There were things in there that explained why this exploitation was taking place. For one thing, they said that Native people freely expressed their sexual desires because they didn't have any moral standards. Okay, that was one. So that made them vulnerable. They could be ripped off and nobody had to feel guilty. Okay? There was another comment in there that said they are not as human as white people are. All of this was terrible bigotry and very arrogant, condescending. That's some of the background.
Okay, thanks.
So those the Oblate Fathers and the churches were not only tolerating, but they were actually basically laying out ground rules for it,
That's right.
promoting it.
Yeah. That makes it all the more shocking. And well, I have other stories about what was going on too. At the Blue Quills Residential School, which is now a community college, there was an administrator there who relished the teenage girls. And when I used to visit him, he would go like this, "They can't say no. They don't know how to say no." Well, that led me to be rather suspicious. And he had something going there. I don't know if you'd call it exploitation, but it was a way to woo the most attractive young teenage girls. He appointed them as monitors to work in conjunction with supervisors as helpers, And they were getting $20 a month. This was 40 years ago. And who knows what happened. But parents were apprehensive. In fact, I know that some parents told their children, don't ever go into his office and close the door. That's what some parents said. Now, about the peace movement. I mentioned to you that my family joined the Quakers. The Quakers were, and still are, war resistors. When I was in grade 12, there was a lot of pressure put on me to enlist. This was in 1944. And it got to me after a while, so I quit high school. But my parents made me go back. They said, you're going to finish your year. So I went back. And when you have to go to a draft board and make an application for conscientious objector status, it's very frustrating because you're talking to people who don't believe the way you do, and I'm sure they have very little respect for what we believe in. So one of the common questions that the draft boards would pose was, what would happen if everybody believed the way you do? Well, the answer is obvious, right? But they didn't get it. Or another question was, what would you do if somebody was raping your grandmother? Would you be nonviolent? You know, stuff like that. Anyway, the pressure was there, and I finally said, I'm going to compromise. I'm going to be conscripted, but I'm going to be a non-combatant soldier, and I'm going to ask to serve in the medical corps. Okay? Well, that didn't fly with my parents. They said, if you go that far, you're compromising too much. So I was conscripted when I was 18 years old. I didn't know very much. But I had to learn things quite fast. At one point when I was in these camps, I was going to walk out and go to prison because about 6,000 American war resistors did go to prison during World War II. And I thought, I didn't like the camp environment. I got tired of eating potatoes and cabbage every night for supper. Some of the federal supervisors were quite sympathetic to our position. For example, I worked in North Dakota on an irrigation project along the Missouri River. And that's where I learned quite a bit about surveying, topographic surveying and boundary surveys and all that. Then after being there in 1945, some of us volunteered for the smoke jumpers in Montana. And this was because there was a shortage of men to fill those positions. So many people had been drafted or enlisted in the services. So the Mennonite Central Committee negotiated with the U.S. Forest Service, and they set up a smoke jumper training program exclusively for conscientious objectors. And that's what I went into. And that was not without conflict either. When we arrived for training, we were all lined up, and we were being trained by some guys who had seen service in World War II in the Pacific. And you know, they treated us quite well. But when we arrived there, the guy in charge of that program came out from Missoula to talk to us. And he couldn't claim to have been a smoke jumper. He made his first jump and he broke his ankle. But that was his background. He came out and he said, "Look, you guys, you've got 2 strikes on you now. Don't strike out here." Now, I was turned off. But I stuck it out. So I spent a season there, and then after that, I went to Oregon on another reclamation project where they were building a dam, and I was actually the gatekeeper for the dam. And I got a medical discharge. They sent me to a panel of doctors to be examined because I had actually injured my back training to be a smoke jumper, doing tower jumps. And so they took all the x-rays and they did their report, and they said, "You never should have been conscripted to begin with." I was 4F material. But I'm not sorry I had the experience. Then after the war, I started university in Madison at the University of Wisconsin. And of course, ROTC was a requirement for freshmen. So I had to go and make my peace with the military officers. And they weren't very kindly to me, but I toughed that out. Would I have done the same thing again? I think so. Because after seeing what's happened since World War II, about the lies about why people are dying, it can't be justified. And that applies to Iraq and Afghanistan. Ward Churchill at the University of Colorado got into a lot of political trouble because he intended to make a public speech saying that he understood why 9/11 occurred. Okay? Really, the result of U.S. imperialism and other factors. And they set out to destroy him. He was head of the Department of Ethnic Studies at the University of Colorado. A scholar, a very courageous person, and absolutely honest. And they couldn't stomach that. So I followed his case for a long time, but eventually he sued the University of Colorado, and he was awarded $1 compensation.